So my name's Chris Mane. I'm CEO and co-founder of Peloria, and we're going to talk to you about, what to do, where, and when to transform development using AI to predict change in social phenomena and identify which factors drive change in social phenomena so that we can better target development and humanitarian operations. So the first thing I'm going to speak to you about is how. How do we develop these models that can forecast change in complex human behavior, right? And the trick, unfortunately, with human beings is, unlike predicting change in the weather, we don't respond perfectly and objectively to actual change in reality, right? Anyone that's hung out with any other human being knows we're not always that rational, sadly. So what we have to consider is this gentleman. He's looking down the road, he's seeing the weather changing, he's seeing petrol prices change, he's seeing availability or non-availability of key food items. He's also thinking about these things himself, right? How does he perceive them as he looks at the changing landscape, including the built environment? And what he's also looking at is his telephone, you may have noticed, right? So he's exposed to an information ecosystem that is also simultaneously describing these things. And for us at Peloria, that means if we're going to predict if people are going to flee a situation, if there's going to be change in levels of armed conflict, then we need to understand the dimensions of reality and the perceptions of reality that are specific to the thing we're trying to predict and how they function in the place we're trying to predict it, right? So that means we need to engage with multidisciplinary expertise specific to those issues in that place, as well as lived experience from that place, in order to help us identify which dimensions of the natural world, right? Which dimensions of society, change in demography, change in the economy, change in the number and severity of political or violence events, change in the built environment, the number and density of built structures, the scale and nature of land transportation infrastructure, the size and location of extractive industries, mining operations, but also what people are saying and what people are reading about these things on social media, on online news, right? So it's about trying to identify the dynamic relationship between reality and people's perceptions of it so that we can feed a predictive model the data necessary for it to comprehend the dynamic change and be able to accurately predict, right? But of course, many of you, I'm sure, are thinking, oh, well, that must be nice. But in many of the places I work, we don't have that data available. And you're exactly right. Here in one of the most data-scarce territories in the world, the Horn of Africa, right, we confront this challenge, right? This is the borderlands territory of Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And for a $330 million World Bank project, the Horn of Africa Drive project, targeted at herders going further and further in search of grazable land, the World Bank doesn't really even know how many people are where, right? They might do a household survey, they might do 3 household surveys, right? But still, those are just snapshots in time that don't show the bank how the population is changing over time, right? And so what we did is we created an object classification model, applied it to satellite imagery, and we're able to count for every month for 5 years changing number and density of built structures in 56 towns and cities across this territory. Then we're able to predict that change. Then we're able to identify which dimensions of the economy, of climate, of levels of conflict, and people's perceptions of those things are most associated with change, so the World Bank can better target those resources at those things across those places, right? The same thing you might think for change in levels of crime, right? Crime is a first-order development problem. Often governments will give you annual data, right? For a machine learning model, we need not just historical depth in the data, so data representing change over a long period of time, but we need data representing frequent change, right? So annual data, it's not going to cut it, right? The machine learning model needs to see as many instances of change as possible, right, to identify the changing configuration of all these thousands or tens of thousands of dimensions of reality and perception of it. Right? And so we train models that read the newspapers, identify which articles talk about crime, read those articles, count the number of crime incidents, check the dimensions of those crime incidents, and check we're not double counting them, right, across all the reporting over time. Then we can predict, and then we can identify what factors are driving change. So this all sounds like a fun research project, right? But it has to be actionable. Right? So why would we do this? Next door in Uganda, the World Bank has the Development Response to Displacement Impacts Project, right? And that seeks to relieve the pressure placed on host communities when refugees enter. And Uganda hosts the highest number of refugees in Africa. It just went over 2 million the other day, 1.8 million there. That's a stat from last year. But the problem is the bank designs these projects, including deciding what activities it's going to finance, at what scale and what location, at the start of a 5-year project, right? And as we all know, situations change, need changes. And that's exactly what happened in 2014, 2016. In the middle of the project, the scale of refugee inflow increased dramatically, but of course they didn't know if it was going to be coming from DRC or if it was going to be coming predominantly from South Sudan, right? And that can affect dramatically which parts of the country come under the most stress. And so what we did was we identified the public service capacity, number of health centers, number of school classrooms, number of functioning water points in each of the districts that host refugees. And then by looking at the changing population, host community, and refugee community, we're able to identify the number of persons per health center, number of persons per water point, number of school-aged children per classroom, right? So we could measure it, and then they could have prearranged finance set aside that disperses once levels of measured pressure breached a certain threshold, right? It allowed the government of Uganda to allocate resources to the districts and the sectors that were needed most, right? That also enhanced the government's legitimacy. But they also came back to us and said, this is so much better than where we were designing this project at the start and then putting resources proportionally across these districts, despite dramatic change and need. However, when the refugees enter, then we're doing these measurements, we're triggering, we're procuring the new schools or health centers, and we then do the construction. But the point of greatest tension between refugee and host communities is when someone's child comes home one day and says, I was in a 50-person classroom yesterday, now it's 140, right? And so this is, can we get ahead of this? They asked us. We'd showed them what we'd achieved in the Horn of Africa, forecasting for another bank project, change in population. They said, can you predict refugee flows? Because if you can, right, we'll be able to trigger a disbursement in advance, do the procurement, start the construction, right? And even if the construction's not finished, the host community will see that something's happening, right? And so that's exactly what we tried to do. And here, you can see for the refugees coming from DRC, the number of refugees that actually entered in the dotted green line, and the number of refugees over a 4-month, 120-day look-ahead period that we predicted, right? But we go further than that, and so for our colleagues that run World Bank and humanitarian operations in the DRC, they can also see which factors are most associated with increase and decrease in the levels of refugee flows from DRC into Uganda. The same thing for South Sudan, right? Here you can see predicted versus actual, and you can see those factors most associated with change, right? So that our bank colleagues there in Juba can more precisely target what activities they finance, at what scale, in what location, and when. But of course, like these graphs, it's all fine to have the to have the data for it to be optimally operational, not just for the bank, but even more importantly for the governments, so they can better prioritize their budgets, right? But also for our humanitarian colleagues, they need to be able to come and click, and this is what we just came from Uganda presenting how we're going to potentially visualize this. They'll be able to click on any refugee hosting district in Uganda. They'll be able to see on over 1 month, 3 month, 6 month look-ahead periods how we're able to predict, or how well we're able to predict, and what that means for health pressure, education pressure, and water pressure in that specific district, right? We're looking at Kamwenge district there. Further, they'll be able to tell our colleagues in DRC, here are the factors most associated with change, if you look in the middle at the bottom. And here's what you can do if you wait until they come, on the right-hand side, down in the right-hand corner. But if we act beforehand on the left, here's what's going to happen in that specific district, right? But of course, we can change and adapt these models, right? Instead of forecasting and explaining change in refugee flows, we can adapt them to forecast and explain change in poverty, macro fiscal pressure. We can expand territorially, right? And so that's what we're talking about with the government of Uganda now, to expand into Uganda itself and actually collect data representing these factors in those host districts, so that we can also look at and predict, we can also measure and then predict change in levels of employment, change in levels of basic needs across the host and refugee communities, change in levels of food and security, and the drivers of those things. So the bank and the government of Uganda and our humanitarian colleagues can target those factors in those refugee hosting districts more precisely in terms of what they do at what scale, where, and when to optimize self-reliance for refugees and relieve the burden on the host communities, and ensure that ensure that we foster the very inclusive approach to hosting refugees that the government of Uganda has adopted in policy. So just to conclude, at Peloria, what we do is we develop these models that predict, but even more importantly, explain. So it's not just about what's coming, it's what's associated with change. And that can inform both development and humanitarian colleagues, their approach to designing what they do overall in a country, right? At what scale, in what location, when, and even who they communicate and how they collaborate. But once they start their projects, it can allow them to scale up within a project in an evidence-based way. It can allow them to redesign, and it can assist them in making decisions about operational security of their own staff, and what they do and how that might interact with the security environment. Finally, not finally, but it also provides them from the implementation point of view, the capacity, to take more robust or complement their monitoring and evaluation, because they can look at the factors most associated with change and poverty in a district, right, and then see which of those factors their project actually affects, and therefore more precisely identify, the overall impact that they're having, accounting for all the other things that also affect poverty, right? Now, from my perspective, most exciting is how this can enhance government accountability, right? When we're able to predict, identify the drivers of change, our colleagues in government are able to go to those that might be screaming and yelling about their district, this is what we need. They can show them the evidence, right? This is what we're doing, this is why, and that can then also inform further exploration, more model development, and better outcomes, because that's what we're all here for. If you're interested, please check us out. Peloria.ai is our website. And if you search World Bank social risk AI modeling or World Bank AI refugee prediction, you'll find websites there with more information. Thanks so much.